Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. I'm back to do another weekly update where I just talk about the books that I'm reading. So I will say that this week's update will be significantly more cheery than last week's, partially because I really enjoyed the books that I read over the past week and partially because I'm in a better mood than I was last week, which, might go hand in hand. Not really sure if that's correlation or causation, but So first, I finished Birds of a Feather by Jacqueline Winspear. This is the second book in the Macy Dobbs series, and I mentioned this last week, and I'm not going to dwell on this book too much, but I think I just wasn't quite in the mood for this book, but I still found it relatively enjoyable. I do find that these books aren't really detective novels in the sense that Macy Dobbs is going out and trying to find clues for whatever thing she's investigating, and it seems to me that it's more about the things that Maisie Dobbs is able to sense about people by having conversations with them, which again, depending on my mood, I may or may not enjoy. There was also significantly less personal stuff in this book, which again, personal preference, but I really enjoyed that stuff in the first book, and it feels like they kind of skimmed over that section in the second book. So I'll probably continue on with the series, but I'm not in as much of a rush to get through them as I might have been in the past. But I think that these will be nice to sprinkle in here and there. All right, next I finished Triangulum, which I also mentioned in my video last week. This is pitched as a science fiction novel, but it's probably more speculative fiction, but really it's a coming of age story. So this book is so hard to talk about because there's a lot of different things going on in this story. So when you start reading the book, it's 2040, I believe, and there's this scientist who comes across some materials that claims that it knows when the end of the world is happening, and so it's up to this scientist to read the materials to decipher the validity of that statement. So that first section is written as a letter to whoever finds that information. Then you jump into this next section that is written more like diary entries and documentation of this girl who lives in South Africa, and when she is about 17 years old, and when she's 17 it's the late 90s, so I think it's 1999 exactly. Her mom had disappeared a couple of years ago, and she's convinced that her mom was abducted by aliens. And that section of the book is legitimately just a coming of age story that has this very, very minor science fiction element to it that really is about her dealing with her grief, it seems like. So the science fiction element is that sometimes when she can't sleep, she looks up at the ceiling and sees a glowing triangle, and she believes that there's a machine that's trying to talk to her. Again, I'm saying all this kind of speculatively because as the reader, you're trying to figure out whether or not there's truth in this. Is it just a grief thing? Is it a mental health thing? She is on different medication, so is it a side effect of the medication? All of this different stuff. Then you get into the next section of the book, and it's when this same main character is an adult, in her 20s, and it turns into an espionage type of novel. Yeah, and then it gets to the ending, and it feels a little bit like the book that you're sold at the beginning of the story is not at all what this book is, and it kind of comes back around, but not really. So each element of this book is interesting on its own, but altogether it's not really a full novel in my opinion. I wrote in Goodreads that I think I'm not smart enough for this book, and I think that's completely true too. Like I said, this book takes place in South Africa, and so there's a lot of really interesting discussions and references in here to actual things that have happened in South African history and politics, and how that kind of influences this science fiction narrative, I suppose. And I think those types of connections and creations are really clever. Whether or not that's a full-blown story, I'm not sure. Again, I think that this is one of those things where I was just I don't get it, and I feel that's more on me than the book. I think this is also one of those books that would be better if you're someone who reads a decent amount of science fiction, because I think there were, again, just a lot of things that went over my head. So yeah, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because there is some really beautiful writing in here, and there are elements of this like the coming of age story and the espionage story, which I do have some sort of reference point for that I could kind of wrap my head around that I enjoyed. But as a whole, I just had a really hard time with this. But That being said, I don't want to like discourage people from picking this up if it sounds really interesting. My recommendations, if you do pick this up, is that you try to read as much of it as possible in a single day. Like, I had started it, I think, on Thursday or something like that, but I read the vast majority of it on Saturday, like straight through. And I think that helps you keep track of everything that's going on in this story. I think if you like read this in pieces, it'll be way too confusing. So yeah, like I said, I don't not recommend this book, but it's definitely not the easiest book to wrap your head around. All right, next I finished Shelter by Jung Yoon, and I will not be doing that much of a discussion in this video because I did a whole review on this book. I really enjoyed this book a whole lot. Like, I finished this book on a Sunday and I was like, oh man, I really want to talk about this book in an individual review. So I recorded and edited and, prepped an entire video in a really short amount of time for me personally, but it was totally worth it because yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. So this is a contemporary fiction book, but it feels kind of like a domestic suspense book. In this story, you are following this character named Kyung, who is of Korean descent, and he's married to a white woman, and they have a child together, and they live outside of Boston, and they are basically in over their heads financially. They end up having a realtor over to their house to basically assess their home, to tell them like how much they think they could sell it for, so that way they can kind of like get out of this financial situation a little bit. But they basically find out that they are like underwater on their house. And while the realtor is at their house, she like looks out the window and sees a woman walking like out of the field/woods area completely naked. And it turns out that woman is Kyung's mother. And that basically like sets off everything that happens in this book. If you are someone who enjoys domestic suspense books, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. If you enjoy books with twists and secrets and suspense, again, highly, highly recommend it. It made me feel like super anxious. It hits on some really like great and honest discussions about like past secrets and family history and pride and, covering up your past versus talking about your past and all of this different stuff, but in this really interesting and unique way. Yeah, I just thought it was really, really good. I did not want to put this book down. When you start this story, you like know that there's something happening here that you don't know about. And as you go farther into the story, you're like, but there's still more. Like, there are so many layers to what's actually going on here. I have more thoughts over, again, in my full review. So definitely check that out if you want to know more information about this book. But I highly, highly recommend this one. I know a lot of people have already read this book, but yeah, it's so good. You can add my voice to the list of people talking about how great this book is. Then I did a reread of The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie. I read this for Read or Dead. It is the 100th anniversary of this book being published, and this is the first full-length novel that Agatha Christie published, and also the book that introduced the world to the detective known as Poirot. So yeah, I did a reread of this. I actually read this like 5 or 6 years ago originally, and I think I have a review of it up on my channel, so I'll link to that if I can find it. But yeah, I'm not going to talk about this one too much either because, again, I have a full review of it, even if it is a really old review. But I will just say Poirot is not my favorite detective, but I do enjoy reading his mysteries, or the mysteries that are featuring him, just because they're like interesting detective stories. But I'm definitely more of a Miss Marple girl. And then finally, I read Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is Elizabeth Acevedo's latest book. It just came out this week. And as many of you are aware, I'm a huge fan of Elizabeth Acevedo's writing. I will say that this is my least favorite of her books, but that being said, this is still a pretty good book. This is a contemporary novel written in verse, and I actually listened to the audiobook of this, and the story is told from two perspectives. One of them is Camina, who lives in the Dominican Republic, and her mother passed away, and her father lives in the United States full time and then comes back to the Dominican Republic over the summers, and she lives with her aunt in the Dominican. Her aunt is like a healer almost in the Dominican Republic. Like, she works as a midwife and she helps like just people who are sick in the village and things like that. And she herself has hopes of becoming a doctor, and she actually wants to go to Columbia in New York City, which is where her father lives, and go to med school there. The other point of view is Yahira, who lives in New York City. The story starts off with her getting called into the principal's office because her father has just passed away. It was in a plane crash and he was flying from New York City to the Dominican Republic. And so Camino and Yahira actually have the same father, so they're half sisters, but they don't know of each other's existence until after their father passes away. And so the story is about them dealing with the grief of losing their father while also realizing that they have like another set of family members that they never knew existed, and then sort of like dealing with everything going along with that. So there are a couple of things about this book that made me like not really love it. One, I think, is the fact that because it's written in verse and it's told from two perspectives, it doesn't go quite as in depth as I usually enjoy. So again, I listened to this on audio because I love books in verse written in audio form, and this also has like two separate narrators, one of whom is Elizabeth Acevedo herself. When I'd gotten like halfway through the audiobook, it really feels like not a whole lot happened outside of the plane crash happening, which happens right at the beginning. I think right at the halfway point is when the girls find out about each other and they decide to like contact each other on social media, and they decide that they want to like meet. So the father in the story, in his will, basically had it that he wanted to be buried in the Dominican Republic, and so they're gonna like fly the body out to the Dominican. Yahira basically decides that she's going to sneak out and fly with her father's body to the Dominican. And she tells Camino this and tells her that she's heading out there and all this stuff. Up until that point, a lot of it is just about like them dealing with their grief, which I can deal with, but it feels like nothing else really happens. And then all of a sudden a bunch of things happen. And then once like Yahira gets to the Dominican, it feels like, again, everything just moves really quickly and they don't really wrestle with or reckon with the truth of what's happening in front of them. So earlier this year, I read the book Silver Sparrow by Tayari Jones, and that deals with basically a similar situation, except it all takes place in Atlanta, where there is this man who has two different families and they find out about each other later in life. And I feel like that book dealt with it significantly better because, again, it's fleshed out more, and so you really see these characters grappling with those truths of like who they thought their father was and what their lives really are and all this different stuff. And this book just feels like it waxes over the surface of what all of that means. When they meet each other, there's some like initial conflict, but again, they don't discuss with each other what is going on. Like it feels like everything just takes place in their heads. In their heads, they're like competing with each other, but at the same time, they know that they're competing with each other and not being very fair. They don't actually talk about the stuff that's happening there, and it feels like it all just resolves really quickly. That being said, there is some really great discussions in here about grief and grieving and things along those lines, but it just wasn't deep enough for me personally. So yeah, a little bit disappointing just because I love Elizabeth Acevedo so much. I was expecting a little bit more from her. I read The Poet X, and that's a book written in verse too, but I think because it's told from one perspective, you get a lot deeper sort of discussions there, but because it's told from two perspectives, you get a little bit less, and I think that led to me being a little bit more disappointed. So yeah, I gave this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Again, not bad by any means, but just not as great as her other ones in my opinion. So that is everything I have to talk about this week. I am currently reading Humiliation by Paulina Flores. This is a collection of short stories. I was sent this book by Catapult. This is a collection of short stories that I'm really enjoying. I generally don't read short stories. Usually like when I'm get short story collections, I'll read like the first story or two and then I'll get bored or something. I don't know, but something about this collection is really, really capturing my attention, and I'm sure I will expand upon that thought more once I'm finished with it. I'm not reading anything else at the moment, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to pick up, so you'll have to either follow me on Goodreads or just wait until next week when I talk about it. So yeah, that is everything that I have to talk about this week. Feel free to leave a comment down below letting me know how your reading week has gone, or if you've read any of the books that I talked about here in this video, feel free to leave your thoughts about them down in the comment section as well. So yeah, that's all I have for now, and thanks for watching.